Welcome to The Conquering Truth. I'm Dan Horn.
I'm Jonathan Sides.
I'm Charles Churchill.
And I'm Joshua Horn.
So lately the Democrats have been saying there needs to be regulation of big tech because, you know, the January 6th insurrection, it was caused and fomented on things like Facebook, and then you have all the other white supremacists and all of them are gathering together because they use Facebook as a platform to connect to like-minded people. So you need to censor them and cut down on that information. And then on the other side, the Republicans are saying, well, you know, Facebook and Google and all these, they were covering up the fact that Hunter Biden had you know, and the story has evolved a lot since then and showed a lot of evidence that Hunter Biden was doing illegal things and selling his connection to his father. And so they're saying that big tech was against them and was not allowing political speech. So they want regulation, different regulation on big tech for that reason, to make sure that they follow the First Amendment. And then recently a whistleblower came out who says she was there, and shockingly, Facebook, when they make decisions, they make decisions on the profitability of the company. So as Christians, how are we supposed to think about all these things? How do these things work together, and what should our view of these things be, I think, is what we want to talk about tonight.
Neither side in this political fight is looking at this from a biblical point of view. The Republicans and the Democrats, they don't have a goal of saying, what does God's word say about these things? They're not interested in doing what God has designed government to do, which is to constrain evil and to promote justice. Instead, they see government as a way to promote their own political power, to enact the will of the people, to give them an advantage or to give them increased power or to damage their enemies. And so, you know, there's just a part of it where we should understand, just first off, that government isn't the fundamental solution to this problem. And the government, even the part of the problem that government should solve, they're not thinking about it from a biblical point of view. And so the answer needs to come from the church. The answer needs to come from God's word. I mean, the Bible says that the church is the pillar and ground of the truth. And that's a really bold statement that Scripture makes. It's a really comprehensive statement about where answers come from. And everybody's looking to the government to solve these problems, and that's just fundamentally the wrong place to start.
And I think just to add to the list of people who aren't thinking about it, biblically would be the big tech companies themselves. I mean, you know, whatever gets said here, don't take it as pro big tech companies. You know, I think it's be pretty easy to say that the companies are not, by and large, run by Christian people operating on Christian principles. I mean, for the big ones, that's obviously not true. And, you know, you can probably find examples where people are saying, oh, they're censoring me for Christian things, and, you know, without having a case off the top of my head, you know, it's not gonna. I mean, that's kind of to be expected. If not now, then at some point in the future. So this is not an anti-government, pro-company message either that we're trying to argue.
Right. When Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mountain, at that point, being made fun of and persecuted for following after Christ was kind of an old thing at that point. So yeah, we
shouldn't think it's new now.
Right.
And it does seem to me that you look at these people, you look at somebody like Bezos, or you look at Zuckerberg, and how much money that he has, how much money Bill Gates has. There's a point where you go, why earn any more money? And then you want something else. And typically what you want is power. So we should have an expectation that as these men have more money than they could ever possibly spend in their lifetime, right? They'd have to burn it, and then they'd have enough heat in their houses for the rest of their life. If they burned it, they have too much to get rid of in a lot of ways. I mean, you can't even give it away, right? I mean, Gates has more money now, I believe, than when he retired, and yet he's been giving away money as fast as he could the whole time. So it's hard. And so when you have that much money, it stops being a goal to make money. And so then you have to look for something else. And so we shouldn't be surprised that the president of Facebook would want to get involved in political, you know, manipulation. Of course he'll want to. Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post so that he could manipulate the news. He didn't buy it because he's going, oh, I'll make money off the Washington Post. He knew he was going to lose money.
Which is the reason why newspapers were created, right?
Right,
I think there's a part of it where if you hear this, we've gotten so used to hearing slant on things that if you were talking, it would be a black and white picture and there would be ominous music. They have so much money that they look for other things to do. And you don't mean it in any nefarious way. You mean if any person out there had the amount of money they had, there would be a point where you go, my goal isn't to make money anymore. if I want to do good in the world, where else should I look to exert my influence in the world?
Or even if I want to do evil, I
Right,
can't
right.
do evil just by collecting money anymore. There's nothing,
Right.
it
That
doesn't-
particular resource has kind of tapped out in
Right.
its usefulness. And so, and I think there's another part too that I think one of the issues here is it's just how big these things are. Is when things get really big, people start to get irrational about them. Well, they have so much money. They have so much influence. Somebody's got to do something to them, as if there aren't other big things that if you make something bigger that has power to be able to regulate them, you've created a different monster that's also people.
And I think
what I mean?
that's very much what happens with government, right?
Right.
As we go, oh, they're so big, we need to do something. And what we need to do is get back to what government's supposed to do, which is in Romans 13. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same, for he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. There's problems that you can deal with the sword. And probably what things are posted on Facebook is not one of them that's very effective with the use of a sword.
Unless you want to stop all communication. What a sword can do is stop all communication in the area. It can kill people who are communicating. It can terrify them to keep them from communicating. But as far as, like you said, being this fine-grained regulator of who can say what and exactly how it should sound like, a sword's a really bad tool for that. It's really ineffective.
Yeah, and a bit of foreshadowing here. The Bible does talk about how you're supposed to use the sword to regulate certain types of speech, but it's not the proposals that anyone in Congress is making right now.
And again, the use of a sword is a very dramatic step, and most issues should be resolved without going to the civil magistrate. But instead of going, let's resolve things without going to the civil magistrate, the Americans' response is that's the first place to go.
I think we want to kind of get into a little bit of the issues at play here, a little bit of the details of what's being proposed and or what's being argued. And one of those that's coming from the Republican side is free speech, the First Amendment. That Facebook, YouTube, all these people, they're breaking our First Amendment rights. And before we say that, we should look at what the First Amendment says. And it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So the first words there are the ones that I want to point out. Congress shall make no law. You don't have a right to free speech on Facebook under the First Amendment. It is saying that Congress cannot stop you from speaking freely, from publishing things. And this kind of is almost common sense. If you really think about it, if you run a website, it's not a free press for anyone to come and publish. Even if you have a comment section, you have the ability to moderate the comments, to delete things that people say that, are untrue, are even illegal, or that you just don't like. You are able to do that. And Facebook, at certain points, it's the same thing. They're a private company. The First Amendment does not apply to private companies.
There's a lot better ways to deal with it than with a sword, right? If you don't like the way that Facebook is manipulating it, don't invest in Facebook. Don't use Facebook. We want to go that the only solution is the government, and the reality is there's lots of other solutions. Just the reason that, he in the end will respond to the shareholders. And if all of a sudden you're saying, well, if Facebook can't say we're going to promote Democratic Party principles, then you also have to say you can't promote anti-abortion principles in your small company. You're going to have to say, if we compel speech for Facebook, we're going to have to compel speech for everybody, because a government should be just. It should not be biased. I'm not saying that they aren't all the time. They break those laws about being general, but the Constitution, where it says general welfare. But when you think about these things, recognize that if you go, we need to deal with Facebook, we need to deal with YouTube, you're also going to deal with the local grocery store where the guy has a poster on the wall saying, stop abortion now.
And this is something that has been a big issue with, the bakers and all this stuff, having to bake cakes for homosexuals. That's been the argument, is you can't compel them to speak on behalf of, this group of people doing this thing that they consider correctly to be a sin. And so that's the argument that's been made, but now this is being thrown out the window to try to come after these particular companies.
Right, and they're saying that categorically, because they grow to a certain point in size, now all of a sudden they're so powerful that you have to force them to allow any kind of speech, and they can no longer take a position. And that's a dangerous way to judge the world.
And, it's ironic that that's the conservative position, that, that a company
or
became
unreasoned.
so successful. A company was really successful in the open marketplace. Now we have to come in and regulate it.
Right.
That's just...
And it's kind of ridiculous on its face as well, because the proposal here is that, well, the reason why they need to be regulated to have free speech is because they're basically a monopoly. No one else can do it. They're like on the radio and television, there's a certain amount of frequencies that you can have. So they're a public thing that's limited. So we need to ensure that everyone has access to it. But they banned President Trump from Facebook, and so he just posts on his website. The internet, when it's not regulated, is open. Anyone can make a website that anyone can go to, as long as our government doesn't stop them, and it's open. And so President Trump just immediately started competing with them, and I'm sure had probably millions of people going to his website.
And part of it is that fundamentally we've always, as a nation, we've held two different positions, right? You can have like a phone line where nobody's regulating what you say on the phone line. And then you can also have a newspaper where somebody's making the decision, this is what will be in there and this is what won't be in there. And the backbone of the internet is basically open. There's some exclusion to that. But in general, the backbone of the internet is not saying you can't post on here because we don't like the packets that you're sending across. But the content providers that are sitting on top, the content providers have always made a decision about what content they'll provide, even if they're just reposting something that somebody else gave, which is exactly what letters to the editor in a newspaper are.
So, I'm going to try and slow that down again, because there's a lot to unpack there. Fundamentally, what's the difference between somebody like a newspaper or a book publisher and a telecom provider?
Should you allow somebody to go on the roads because he's a white supremacist? Well, no, you can't stop him from driving on the roads for that, because the roads are for public use. And so there's public use vehicles, which would be telecom, which would be electricity, roads. There's certain things that are public access that everybody has the right to use, independent of who you are. And then there's the people that are actually publishing content. They're not just using the backbone they're not just using the equivalent of a road, right? The internet backbone is the equivalent of a road that connects you from one address to another. That's basically what the internet does. And that's very different than going in this house that's at one end of the road. This is what I need to have in the house. I need to allow anybody to come into my house, which is what the publisher is doing, is saying, I want the things in my house that I want in my house. And that publisher, it might be a huge mansion like Amazon, where they're saying, I don't want that product and I want this product. Well, that's their house. It's no longer the road, it's their house. And there's fundamentally a different thing when you're saying this is the house and where you're a utility.
And the utility also comes down to the fact that the way they got those phone lines by and large to the houses is by using the power of government to force people to let them put the line through their property. It's eminent domain. So and they're not doing that for any company that says I want to do it. They do it for, one or two or however many companies in each given area. So it's something where the government has already picked, these are the people who are going to provide this service to the public. And if the issue was that, Comcast or Spectrum or whatever is banning you from going to DonaldTrump.com, well, that would be an entirely different issue, because now it's stopping you from using that public conduit, that wire in the ground, to access Donald Trump's server that he has his website on. But that's not the issue. The issue is forcing Facebook to host Donald Trump on their servers, which is different. So I wanted to mention one other thing on the First Amendment, which is the Democrats' proposals to say, well, because Facebook is pushing this, content that's harming people, we need the government to get information so that eventually they can regulate their algorithm or whatever. And that's where you start to come into the First Amendment, because then you have government regulators, a group established by Congress, saying you need to either ban these people from your platform or not show their content as much on your platform. And then you would have Congress breaking the First Amendment using it. But it's by putting in more regulation, not less regulation.
Right.
And I do think, I mean, what the Republicans are saying is that they want to compel speech, which is just as dangerous, right? They're saying that Facebook, they were stopping people from seeing posts about Hunter Biden, for instance, before the election. Well, they have every right to. And really, we're going to say that it's a good idea to compel speech?
Right.
I mean, that's a really dangerous step to take.
What you have the right to do when they do that is to let that harm Facebook's reputation. You know what I mean? When Facebook makes that decision, everyone should look at them and go, okay, so you're, you know what I mean? They, where they say we're open and we let all these things go, people should look at them and go, no, you don't. You're not being truthful about that. You're not being honest about this. You do have an agenda. You do make decisions in a biased way. But the answer isn't, and because of that, we get to, no, it's just like when you run into someone who's a jerk, you go, you're a jerk, but I don't get to sue you for being a jerk. And companies can be exactly that same sort of way.
And they should be, and they are being. And half the country, I'm sure, you look at the polls, that they're going to have a much less favorable opinion of these big tech companies because they have been doing things that are ridiculous. Banning the sitting president for not much of anything. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Right.
But they're appealing to their base, right? I mean, Twitter users tend to trend a lot younger than Donald Trump supporters, so they banned Donald Trump because they thought they'd get more users.
And they're trying to forestall what Democrats are pushing, which is more regulation of them.
Right. We just wanted to take a quick break from the episode to tell you about an event that's coming up that's put on by Reformation Baptist Church. Every year, our church celebrates Reformation Day. We gather together, we have a good meal together, and we have some talks that express what God has done. As it says in Judges 2:10, the next generation that came after Joshua, they forgot who God was and what he had done. And if we want to be strong as a church, we need to remember what God has done. And Reformation Day, 500 and a few years ago, God really changed things. And it's important for us to remember that, to have hope for the future and to have an expectation that God will continue to change things and improve things, because he is the one that is putting all his enemies under his feet. This year on October 29th, 2021, we'll be gathering together to celebrate Reformation Day. We'd like to invite you to join us if you're in the Raleigh area, to come and have a good meal with us. It's free of charge. We'll talk about what God has done. It's a time to celebrate together. If you're not in the Raleigh area, please join us by live stream. We hope to be live streaming it as well. The place to find out more information is celebratereformationday.com. The big debate is about Section 230 and how that applies. And I do think it's worth considering some of the history, because some of the history of what was going on that caused them to pass Section 230 is the government was trying to get content providers to do more censoring. And it's, and as we're talking and as the nation's saying, oh, should we do this or we should do this because Section 230 is broken, we should remember this was the attempt by the government to do this already, and it causes problems. And if they do it again, it will cause problems again. I mean, one of the issues at the time was...
So what time?
This was 1996.
That's what it says on the screen.
Oh, this was 1996. Okay. So, and remember, in 1996, they were wondering why the amount of internet had to double every year for Clinton's White House. And they went to figure out what they were using the internet for. And what they found was 50% of it was used for watching pornography. So this is what's happening, right? Is everybody understands that if that's what the Clinton White House is like, everybody else is probably using it 20% because it is the Clinton White House after all. But that there's this huge increase of pornography. And so they're trying to say, how do we stop pornography? And there was a Democrat and a Republican that wrote the bill, or wrote the Section 230. And so what happens, though, is there's two ideas. One is there had been a lawsuit that a bookstore had pornographic materials in one of their books, and somebody went in and saw it, and the bookstore got charged with distributing pornographic materials.
This was back in 1959.
Yes.
Okay.
And so when that happens, his defense was, I didn't even know. I have, 1,000 books here. How I'm supposed to read every one? And the court said that's unreasonable. And so the decision became, if you're a distributor, you don't have liability. Unless you know about it. In that case,
when the court said
then
it's
you
unreasonable, they said it's unreasonable to expect you to know what's in any book. You're just distributing books that come in.
But if somebody says this one's pornography and then you don't pull it off the shelf, now you're intentionally distributing pornography and you're breaking the law. And so he got off. And then what happens is the internet comes along and these other people are doing similar things, and you have two cases. In one case, they go, the internet is a distributor, so it doesn't matter what they distribute. And then in the other case, I think it was Prodigy, they went, the court, because it was a slightly different situation, they were publishing some things, so they said they're a publisher, so therefore they're liable for anything that's on the site.
It was CompuServe and Prodigy, and if anybody remembers Rush Limbaugh used to promote CompuServe. Right. And I don't remember Prodigy, but I remember because
I remember Prodigy. But so what happens is that the Congress was expecting everybody to go, somebody wants to post pornography, we can't stop them, because the only way to be safe from getting sued is to say, I'm a distributor, I don't know what anything is, I'm not paying attention to anything that's being distributed. And so the Congress didn't want the increase of pornography because it was already a big problem. And so they turned around and they passed this bill. And the point of this bill was to encourage censorship.
And this was the Communications Decency Act. I mean, it was
Right.
actually
It was
broader
part of
than
the-
just Section 230. It was actually a full act that was designed to
That
deal
was
with
modifying the Telecommunication Act of 1933, I think, which is Section 230 of the Telecommunication Act is what the Section 230 refers to. So anyway, so that's the context that they're doing this in. And so here's what Section 230 actually says. Section C, which is the section that matters in terms of this discussion. Protection for Good Samaritan, blocking and screening of offensive material. Number 1, treatment of publisher or speaker. No provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. So that's saying if I publish somebody else's content, I'm not the publisher, they are. Even though it's sitting on my server, and it's my website, et cetera, et cetera. And then civil liability, which this is the part that ends up causing problems. No provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be held liable on account of A, any action voluntarily taken in good faith to restrict access to or availability of material that the provider or user considers to be obscene, lewd, lascivious, filthy, excessively violent, harassing, or otherwise objectionable, whether or not such material is constitutionally protected, or B, any action taken to enable or make available to information content providers or others the technical means to restrict access to materials described in paragraph 1. In the context of it, I mean, it does say or anything else, kind of, any other objectionable materials, but it was really to stop obscene, lewd, lascivious. It was to stop what was the direction that the internet was going, by allowing content providers to stop from publishing that content.
So if I can just really shortly summarize it, on the one hand, they're saying that an internet provider is not liable for information material that is published on that they publish. Or on the other hand, they're not liable if they see something and decide to take it down.
Right.
So they're not liable for what's there. They're not liable for what they take down.
Right.
What people are saying about this now is, well, Facebook is filtering stuff, therefore they shouldn't get this protection because they're filtering out, whatever Republican stuff, say, which
they find objectionable.
Right. So that's the thing is, the law is explicitly giving them permission to filter things.
And the bigger problem is how the appeals court actually treated this law. Because there was a guy after the Oklahoma City bombing about a week later, and I don't remember which company it was that published it, but they basically published on their website this thing about him, or a man who had nothing to do with the bombing. They put his name, they put his phone number, and he's getting death threats. I mean, he ends up having to take medication. I mean, he's in a really rough situation where everybody in the country, not everybody, but a large number of people in the country are going, "You're the one who blew up a daycare." And so he goes to them and says, "Take it down." And they go, "We have no liability." And they refuse to take it down. He sues, and the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which the Supreme Court left that decision, basically said, "Yep, no liability."
And I haven't seen this decision, but I'm assuming that the people he was suing were not the authors of this content, because that's what the law is saying. You know, one thing that people confuse a lot is that there's a category of whether you're a publisher company or a distributor company, and it's not as much what type of company you are. It's the actual actions that are taken related to the content. So, you know, there's nothing if a company put up stuff slandering someone that they put up, or a user, that person, the Section 230 does not protect them in any way.
Like if Facebook had put on their own blog this information about him, Section 230 as written, who knows what a court would do, but it should not protect. It was not written to protect Facebook's private blog from them being able to publish information without being sued for slander.
But what happens here now is you have something that's very different, right? Before, to be a publisher, you had to have printing presses. You have to have all this other stuff. Now, to be a publisher, you can be on your personal computer that you have, and you publish it, and it happens to go viral. Right. And all of a sudden, this person who may have $20 to his name, and even if you sue him and win, they refuse to take it down. So it didn't matter because they're going, "We have no liability." And so it seemed to me the courts took this interpretation and took it to a pretty ridiculous level to say there's basically, even when you know it's wrong, because the standard before, if we go back to the basic law of the guy who was distributing the books, is once he knew it had obscene material, it was illegal material in it, he now incurred a liability. But Section 230 is written so that you don't, so that they can attack somebody, they can slander somebody, they can, the first post can't be them, but afterwards they can use it to destroy whoever they want, and they have no liability. Right. That seems to me to be problematic.
Right. Let's be clear about what you're saying versus what the conservative world at large is saying. You know, and I think there could be valid things to say that Section 230 should be modified in certain ways, but what people are concerned about, removing people from social networks, or restricting them in some way, or putting warnings on their content, none of that would be affected by this change you're suggesting. And none of that would be affected by the change that most of the conservative politicians are suggesting. A lot of what they're suggesting doesn't actually affect what they're claiming that it affects. If Facebook puts a warning on your post saying this might be misleading, here's what our fact checkers say, and that warning is slanderous, you can sue them. It's opinion, you're going to lose. And they can be a pro-democratic social network if they want to. There's nothing stopping them. Just like the blog that I moderate comments for, there's certain things you can't say on there. And that's their right to do it. And so reforming Section 230, like you're talking about, could fix some things, but it's not the things that people are out there really upset about the big tech companies.
Right, because what they want the government to do is come in and compel Facebook to be fair to Republicans, quote unquote, whatever that means, which you do not want the government to decide what that means.
Which is ironic because you go back, I remember listening to talk radio 20 years ago, and there was there was Fairness in Broadcasting Act that the Democrats were trying to push, and they wanted to put that, like if there was a show with a conservative show for 3 hours, that the radio had to put a Democrat show for 3 hours, and they had to give them exactly the amount of time. And conservatives were absolutely against that. They were like, no, the marketplace will decide. It doesn't,
there's no principles. It's almost like they're just looking for whatever is a political advantage.
Right. And so, it's been very interesting to watch sort of the evolution of this thinking change and really kind of flip on its head.
Right. And that's the thing. There's a lot of people out there who are just making whatever argument it takes to have it benefit them, and they're just talking, they're just gut reaction. I don't like that. Let me find a law that we can change to stop it.
Right.
And with this, the way they're going about it, like with the whistleblower, the American people need to start waking up and paying attention to how they're being manipulated.
We have to do air quotes every time we say whistleblower,
Yeah,
right?
because here you have a woman who worked for Facebook. She was product manager for Facebook, and she is basically a Democratic operative. They've connected her back. I mean, she was with the Vindman, the quote, another air quote, whistleblower
right.
at the Trump hearing. I mean, the same attorneys. She's a Democratic operative, but they want to say, oh, she's a whistleblower, so you need to listen to her. Their technique that I've seen the Democratic Party use multiple times recently, they keep going over this, where they keep doing it, and especially the church and the American people need to go, stop it. You do not take a policy issue and pretend like this person's at great risk of her life. They're playing the American people for such fools. And the problem is the church isn't going, stop it. You're playing us for such fools. But that's because it's not that much different than a lot of Sunday morning services. Instead of fulfilling Isaiah 1, that's where God says to them, you're disobeying, you're doing all these things, I'm disgusted with you. Come, let us reason together. The church has abandoned reason and just makes emotional appeals. And that's what the Democrats are doing to try to move policy. The same thing that most churches in America do.
While all that's happening, like Joshua said at the beginning, there's this third party that with the big tech that has their own set of interests, and they're probably perfectly happy watching a political debate happen between the Republicans and the Democrats about it, because the way that they make their money, the way that they have their influence is by selling advertising. That's the way Facebook, Google, that's the way they've monetized themselves. So, wouldn't you want everybody to think that you are more powerful and more influential than you actually are? So as you're trying to sell advertising to one group of businesses, companies, people who want to buy ads, isn't it great to have all of this press about how you might have influenced an election?
Oh, yeah.
About how, that everybody.
Where do you want your content to be? On the thing that nobody watches, or the one that everybody is terrified of because it could rip the world apart? Advertise with us.
Exactly. So, I don't think that they have any concerns whatsoever that you've got these kinds of discussions going on very publicly that might look damaging, but because really it's establishing their reputation as being incredibly powerful, probably a lot more powerful than they actually are.
Yeah, I mean, somebody who actually read all the documents. I did not read all the documents that she brought. I mean, she brought a lot of documents, but they said, what I read is a company that's in serious trouble that's about to collapse because they're so panicked about everything. I mean, reading it as somebody who was on boards of lots of companies, he goes, I've been on boards of companies like that, and that's a company about to go out of business. You mentioned Rush Limbaugh before, where he was talking about the,
fairness and equality.
Fairness, I forget what the exact,
or something.
Yeah, fairness in broadcasting. But you look at that, and that was, in a lot of ways, an enforced monopoly. There were only so many stations that were VHF, and then you had a lot that were UHF. And so the VHF channels, there weren't that many broadcasters, so you basically had three. You had CBS, NBC, and ABC. But in that meant that they were the ones that had like national coverage, and it was pretty much enforced because of the frequencies. And so you turn around, and what Limbaugh was saying is they had a monopoly, but I could bring down the monopoly.
Right.
Because I didn't say I have to be on television. He just went on the radio. And he did a 3-hour show on the radio. And so these people who were sure they had a monopoly and locked down, monopolies aren't what they're made out to be. They're not nearly as powerful as they made out to be. Does Facebook have a monopoly? Absolutely not.
Right.
How in the world can you think they have a monopoly? Does YouTube have a monopoly? Absolutely not. There's a pretty good argument that the only people that have monopolies are governments because they're the only ones that can use force to create the monopoly. And so anything else, somebody will come up with a way to work around it if the problem with the so-called monopoly is significant enough. And the thing with Facebook is everybody's going to have a monopoly. Well, guess what? If people are that disgusted that they make half of America ticked off, they're not going to have a monopoly for long.
Really important thing is it comes back to faith. There's a part of it where our reaction to Facebook is we do not believe that the church is the light of the world. We don't believe it. I mean, because there's this part of it where, I mean, they're spreading so much darkness. I'm sorry, can you step back and tell me how you spread darkness? The only way you spread darkness is you put out light, is you quench the light,
Right.
you cause the light to go out. You can't spread, I mean, you have to block light. You have to get in the way of light. And light actually sends the darkness, it sends the darkness fleeing. And so there's this part of it where, I mean, I think there's just a real fundamental problem, and I see it in myself, I see it in the church at large, is we don't believe that the truth has power. We don't believe that the church actually can change the world. We don't believe we're the salt of the earth. We don't believe with Jesus Christ when he says, I don't light a candle and put it under a bushel basket. And so there's this part of it where, I mean, do we actually believe what God said? Because our actions really don't make it sound like we do. We think Facebook is the most powerful thing. We think government is the most powerful thing, as opposed to when you read Romans 13, Jesus Christ says, they're work
my
for
servant.
me.
Yeah.
It's like, I mean, it's like, why are you terrified of them? Why are you terrified of them?
The church isn't willing to say there's a significant cost to these things and we need to stop it. And I think that's one of the big problems, right? Is the solution to this is not the government passing some rule about Facebook. The solution is the church going, do you know how evil this is? And I'm not saying all of Facebook's evil, but there are aspects of Facebook that are incredibly evil.
Not that I'm disagreeing with you, but I wanted to say the other side. What if that is the church's response? Is that's how the church is speaking truth to power, is to say, oh, okay, you know what, Facebook has gotten too big. They have too much power, and let's say that's where the church wants to draw the battle lines. That's how they're defining the issue, and that's how they're addressing is evil.
And I think that they have to, I mean, they're not the ones that get to decide what's good and evil. It's God that gets to decide what's good and evil. And they need to look at something and say, what is evil about that? And you can list lots of things that are evil about Facebook, right? I mean, it is basically a gossip site. That's pretty evil. But deal with the desire for gossip, deal with the spreading of gossip, deal with these things. We're not allowed to just go, we think they're evil because they're too big. The reason they're so big is because as a society, we love gossip. It says in Proverbs 26, 20 through 22, where there is no wood, the fire goes out, and where there is no talebearer, strife ceases. A charcoal is to burning coals and wood to fire, so is a contentious man to kindle strife. The words of a talebearer are like tasty trifles, and they go down into the inmost body. And so there's this picture that as long as there's people out there that want to hear things, as long as there's people out there that just want to, tell me something new, is that wants to keep scrolling. And the church isn't going, this is wrong. This is how you promote. I mean, the only reason Facebook is so powerful is because the people who go to church, they don't go, stop it. They don't go, you have to stop wanting to, let's forward something else and let's talk about this and talk about that. And instead, we're supposed to be productive people. And instead, all we want to do is sit on Facebook all day and scroll. The power is because of the power of sin.
I mean, I remember growing up, there were times where a movie would come out and religious groups would come out and condemn it. And that movie frequently would not be as successful because of that condemnation. Sometimes it would be successful with a certain group because of that condemnation, and they kind of knew that that's what that would get them. But I mean, it would prevent things from being widely distributed. There were people that would do things, and the church would come out and speak out against it, and they would cancel what they did. And there's this sense, I mean, we've forgotten the influence that the church has, that the church actually can have in the world. And part of it is because the church wants those things. The church has stopped speaking out against them. I mean, we consume the same filth that the world consumes, and then we turn around and we go, why isn't the world a cleaner place? I mean, that's not going to cut it.
And as long as the people in the pews want to go to Facebook and spend a lot of time and spread gossip and send things to this and that and blah, 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 what would we expect? I mean, the church can't speak forth with light unless it first cleans its own house, right? The unclean cannot convince other people to become clean. And there's just the issue has to be, the church has to start saying within itself, how are we spending our time? How much are we doing slander before we can expect that slander to be rejected by us as a nation? And there's been a lot of slander over the last 5 years, right, in politics. A lot of slander, like real, things that were provably proven to be lies. There were things that have been proven to be lies. Sorry.
That was great.
It's going in. I don't know why you're doing it again.
There's things that have been proven to be lies, and yet everybody repeats them and repeats them and repeats them and repeats them ad nauseum, and nobody thinks anything about it. And it happens in the church. It happens everywhere. And we just need to stop. We can't expect the society to hold slander significantly if the church doesn't.
And I want to back up to what you said about it should terrify us, because there's a bunch of terrified people right now, but they're terrified of the wrong thing.
Yes.
You're not saying that they should be terrified of Facebook.
No.
You're saying they should be terrified of a God who looks down on people who don't care about the truth anymore and are happy to consume lies. And this is what,
and especially those who name his name. They're the ones that God says are the salt of the earth. And if the salt has lost its saltiness, it's good for nothing except to be trampled underfoot of men. The church better watch out, or it should expect to be trampled under the foot of men.
So you're saying fear God, not Facebook.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, in a lot of ways, you can look at Facebook and these issues. Really, it's a test from God in a sense to the church, and it's like a trap, because if you actually turn towards God, these problems would go away. But if instead you turn towards your fear and you still want to keep consuming the things you want to consume, it gets narrower and narrower. I mean, you run to the government fix us, and the government goes, come to my arms. The government's not going to turn you away. They're going to, you finally come into the person who can help you. And then they put more restrictions on you, and it becomes even more twisted and more fractured, and it becomes darker and it becomes harder. And then the church, instead of crying out to God again, they just keep going down this hole. And God's sitting there looking at them going, it's like the prodigal son. There's a point where you're eating slop out of a pig's, and God goes, all you have to do is come. All you have to do is recognize who I am, and when will you? But we want the slop.
I keep going back to the Mars Hill story, as it just keeps popping in my mind as we're having this discussion of what the church could do. Is the church could be like Paul, and they could walk into Mars Hill and look around and say, you people don't do anything other than tell and hear something new. And I observe your city is full of idols. I mean, if that's not us.
Right.
And then just
we're not
say,
even smart enough
look,
to make a temple to the unknown God. Then.
Right. I'm going to tell you you're ignorant. You're doing things in ignorance. I'm going to tell you the truth, and then proceed to do that and not really care what the response is, because he gets all the responses. He gets mocked, and then he gets people who say, you know what, we'll hear you again. And the church just needs to recognize that's play strategically. That's a situation we're in. Do that. Be bold. Be willing to say the truth, and not be part of the, hey, let's all just tell and hear something new.
Right.
And, what God has been doing over the last 20 years is he has been lobbing these things, like in a volleyball match where there's somebody, he's setting it up for the church to be able to spike it in the face of the world over and over again. Sodomy. Let's have sodomite marriage. Let's have sodomite, military. Let's have gender fluidity. Let's have, abortion, to go back further. He keeps giving us these issues. What the church says is you shouldn't murder babies, instead of saying, do you know what God does to a nation that sheds innocent blood? He says, I will force you out of the land. How can you run to be a leader of this country when what you're producing and what you're moving for is the destruction of the nation?
And the big thing right now that the church is pushing for on this topic is free speech. We just want to be able to speak freely on the website of our choosing. By going all in on the free speech thing, they kind of have missed some of the things that Scripture has to say about it. If we look, for example, at Deuteronomy 13, 6 through 11. If your brother, the son of your mother, your son or your daughter, the wife of your bosom, or your friend who is as your own soul, secretly entices you, saying, let us go and serve other gods, which you have not known, neither you nor your fathers, of the gods of the people which are all around you, near to you or far off from you, from one end of the earth to the other end of the earth. You shall not consent to him or listen to him, nor shall your eye pity him, nor shall you spare him or conceal him, but you shall surely kill him. Your hand shall be first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hand of all the people. And you shall stone him with stones until he dies, because he has sought to entice you away from the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. So all Israel shall hear and fear, and not again do such wickedness as this among you. So the church is all in on, we just want free speech. We just want to be able to say what we want. When in most churches, the passage that I just read, they would not be on board with that at all in the slightest under any circumstances in modern times. And now, obviously this law is not going to go into America immediately because, we've talked about before, we're not even a Christian nation as the United States of America. So there's not like this is going to be put in. But when people are not willing to say, no, you shouldn't be able to advocate for worshiping false gods. And under ideal circumstances, that would be illegal. And so when we put free speech in a place above the word of God, we've kind of already compromised and we've already given up scripture for the sake of to avoid persecution, whatever it might be. We have this restriction on under God's law of freedom of speech. At the same time, it is a pretty high standard. It's not that you have a doctrinal problem. It's not that you're misinterpreting things. It's not there's a whole list of things it's not. It's saying let's go worship a false god, which is allows for a wide range of error underneath that. And even under God's law, there are not super strict slander laws. Proverbs has a lot of things that you shouldn't slander people, but I think it'd be kind of, you could debate all day. We could debate all day about how it would fall under God's law, but it would probably be similar to our law, where you'd have to prove that you had deprived someone of something, you had stolen something from someone.
That you would cause
by
harm,
slander.
right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and so
it's really a form of theft, right?
Right.
It's using your mouth to steal.
Right. Our country has a high standard to prove if you're trying to prove slander, and it'd probably be the same under God's law. So there are principles of free speech that are legitimate. But to say it's completely open, you've missed some major things.
Every nation has blasphemy laws. There are words right now that if one of us said, the nation has said, you will not say those words. You're not allowed to say them. If you say them, we will socially destroy you. And there's this part of it where you go, if you said that people should react that way about someone taking God's name in vain, that would be horrible. We should never do that. And you kind of step back and you go, really?
Slander and blasphemy are the same thing.
Right.
Right. It's just slander is a broader term, but it basically means the same thing as blasphemy. It means to make false, disparaging remarks about somebody. That's slander and that's blasphemy. And you can blaspheme somebody as well as blaspheme God.
Right.
But blasphemy towards God, we think it's okay to have slander laws against people, but blasphemy against God, we should allow that. We should allow slander of God. Why? Where does that become reasonable?
I think what you were trying to motivate with the blasphemy laws was not necessarily that there's actually laws that you could go to jail if you say certain things, but more like that there are standards that every culture has that if you violate this, if I'm reading you right.
Well, there starting to be laws about hate speech. There's starting to be laws where you can go to jail because they will say, if you say this, it means that you hate this other person, and these words will be construed to be, it will be hateful, and we will make them illegal. And so there is, so those
we're not
laws,
Canada yet.
We're not Canada yet, but we're moving in that direction of creating even laws that govern the intent of speech that you say. You will always venerate something. And you'll always venerate, and I would say in the United States, it's changing what has been venerated. So we haven't moved to the point where we've made these things, but you will always move in that direction.
At the time that we're recording this, we're just a few days removed with a very high-profile NFL football coach, head coach, who was forced to resign from his job because emails from 10 years ago surfaced in which he said things that are not culturally acceptable anymore. The point that I'm going at there is that at this point, I don't think anything that he said was illegal.
I agree with that.
Vile, absolutely,
and not necessarily any problem with him even losing his job or
but the point is, look, the secular world knows this. They figured out, hey, this guy violated some social norms, but he didn't break the law, and yet he still paid significant consequences for it.
Right.
There's machinery for doing that kind of thing. And what we've sort of all been talking about here is the church used to be able to do that. The church used to
be part of that
they
machinery.
used to be the salt. And now that what's motivating that is very much an anti-Christian worldview. And this is not in any way defending what happened, not in any way defending the coach.
When it leaves the church, it becomes untethered from any standard. And I'll give you a very specific example. When Hunter Biden wrote, where he used certain terms that are far worse than anything that coach used, well, when it's completely untethered from any principles, Hunter Biden's fine. Nobody goes after him, but they destroy this coach. In Hunter Biden's words, if you look, we're far, far, far worse. And yet, no problem with him. And when the church, Micah 6:8, do justly, love mercy, walk humbly before your God. When the church isn't the one that's doing the enforcement of free speech, you can expect it to be unjust. You can expect it to be very uneven. And so the people that are powerful, the people that have their father as the president, they can say whatever they want. And the people who don't, people who aren't liked for whatever reason, all of a sudden your system of that societal justice becomes incredibly unjust, incredibly uneven, incredibly biased. You just happen to hit the wrong time, and all of a sudden you can be destroyed. And so we should recognize the cost of that system, because there will always be that system. If the church isn't saying, here's the principles for it, it will always end up being unprincipled.
If the church wants to play power games, they're going to lose, because that's the way that the world works.
Right.
God says that's just not the kind of kingdom I'm establishing.
And I want to correct something I said earlier. I said the church used to be part of that machinery. The church used to see itself as part of that machinery. The church still is anything in the world that is constraining evil, anything in the world that is spreading light. Its source is the Church of Jesus Christ. It's either work the church did in the past or it's work the church is doing in the present. But that is where light comes from. And so the church is still very much part of that machinery. It's so common for us not to think of it that way, and we don't realize that that's actually what is constraining sin in the world, the power of the Holy Spirit.
The Bible says that the way there is strength, in Ephesians it says the way there's strength, that there's unity in the Spirit. And that the doctrines of Christ. And the way the church, what I would argue is one of the reasons that the church has lost its ability to speak is we can't speak to one another. Because if all it is emotion, you can't speak to one another. If you don't deal with doctrine, if you don't deal with what do we believe, if you don't come to the unity of the Spirit, you will have no power. And so the church, because we've switched to emotionalism, the church is losing its ability to speak and to actually have the effect that it should have. And the church really needs to say it matters what we believe. Because otherwise, how do you say Facebook's wrong? If all it is an emotion, that's why people go to Facebook. They get the emotion. They go, oh, look, I have 1,000 likes. And it's all about emotion. And
1,000 likes?
And how can... Okay, I've never had 1,000 likes, I don't think, but I've never looked, so how would I know? So, when the church is seeking emotion like the world, in the end, it can't affect the world. The church needs to be obeying. The church needs to be saying the power is in obedience to God. The power is on understanding who God is, on declaring who God is, and not just let's be another element of that machinery. I understand what you mean, that in a sense we're part of that machine, and in a sense the church is a different machine, and we've let another machine take over because we're not fulfilling our role. And we can't just imitate how that machine works, which is really what Jerry Falwell did, right? When you look back, is that moral majority and all that, they just said, oh, let's do the machine like the world does the machine, instead of going, God's told us how to do it. But there are certain things that need to happen in the church before the church can have that effect on the world.
Right. And I mean, one of those things is actually having principles where you have a consistent standard that you're judging things by. Because you look at what the conservative church is going after. They go after certain kinds of vulgarity, but not other kinds of vulgarity. And it comes down a lot of times more to politics or to the particular issue or side that the person is perceived as being on, rather than actual principles that are consistent and that are founded on Scripture.
Right. Which was I remember when President Obama, he's running on Obamacare, and it was the same as Romneycare. And yet, when it was Romneycare, all the Republicans are, yeah. And when it's Obamacare, it's no. It wasn't principles. It was just, we're for this team or we're against this team instead of being for Christ. And the church needs to turn back to being for Christ.
And I think you've said this a couple times about how the church has become emotional, and there's this part of it where one of the reasons why emotion works so well for the world is because the decision to pass a law can be just you generate enough force and then you push the button and you make this new law, and this law, you write the law, you pass the bill, and boom, it's the law. But salvation doesn't work that way. And I think there's this fundamental shift. I mean, salvation is not something, if what brought you to salvation was the strength of your emotions, then that's what's going to keep you there. And as soon as your emotions fade, what you really have isn't really salvation. And it is the work of the Spirit. And it's the Spirit and truth. This is how God must be worshipped. And so there's this fundamental principle that if the most important decision that can be made is when God changes a man's heart and a man turns toward God and begins to obey him, if that decision is just a purely emotional decision, we shouldn't be shocked if all other decisions begin to be viewed that way. Because again, the church really does drive things. The church really does shape the world's view. And so when the church turns back and looks at salvation in the way that God has defined it, the world will actually shift as well. It will have to. It will be driven by the power of the Spirit. It will be driven by the power of the church.
And, Joshua, to go back to what he was saying about blasphemy, and I mean, one of the, as there's a rise of, new Calvinism or restoring of the looking at the doctrines of grace, certainly one of the statements that I've heard multiple times from people is, if that's true, that God chooses who he'll save, then he's a spiritual rapist. That blasphemy happens in the church all the time. And that's worse blasphemy than the blasphemy in the world. And we should recognize that. And so again, how do you deal with blasphemy in the world? How do you deal with turnout, somebody, let's follow after another god, like it says in Deuteronomy 13, or what it says later on in there, where it says, if a city's doing this, burn the city to the ground and make it a burnt offering, essentially. If we're not willing to say, this is who God is, and that's a denial of the nature and character of God, and it is offensive to him, to people who call themselves Christians, then how can we affect the world? We need to start closer to home.
So there's some good news. There's, from my impression is that there's a lot more Calvinists in the church today than there were 20 years ago. So
that's my
headed the right
as well.
direction. Maybe.
If they're not doing it just to be, because some, clearly, you look at Mark Driscoll and others, that there were some that were doing it just to be rebellious.
Right.
As opposed to believing the doctrine. May there be more people that believe the doctrine now, because as Jesus Christ said, or on the mount to Moses, that this is my glory. I will have compassion on who I have compassion. I will have mercy on who I have mercy. That is his great glory of God. And when we deny that, it is a form of blasphemy. Thank you for joining us as we talk about the power of big tech. It's important for the church to remember that in Acts 1, Jesus Christ said, I need to ascend to the Father so that I can send power from on high, the power of the Holy Spirit. We don't need to fear the power of Facebook. What we need to do instead is turn to God as the Church of Jesus Christ and expect to have far greater power than any of these big tech people could possibly have. The power to actually affect the world in a good way. We should not expect depraved sinners who hate God to affect the world in a good way. That comes from the church. May the church repent. Thanks for joining us.
This has been The Conquering Truth, a project of Reformation Baptist Church. If you found this helpful, you can visit us online at theconqueringtruth.com and subscribe here or in your favorite podcast app. Thanks for watching.